work is not mine, in that I wasn't the author, I was the translator. And it's the first English language translation of a work by Julie Favre, La Morale des Stoiciens, through something called Planktos Press, which I began a couple of years ago. Having navigated the publishing world with my previous academic works, I thought I would do it myself. And this is one of the first forays into that exercise. I'm also on the cusp of losing my voice, the most annoying thing that an event organizer can hear from a presenter, I'm sure. So bear with me if there's like some fluctuations and you haven't heard anything clearly, just let me know. So Stoic Ethics, our duty to each other, defends the idea of a universal morality. What a universal morality means is, let's say, a set of rules, ethical rules that apply to all. Favre investigates this through the idea that there are duties or responsibilities that we have to each other for the Stoics. So that would be the universal ethic. I spoke about this with a couple of people earlier when you came to investigate the work of the book or to buy the book, thank you. The structure of the book is that she writes a series of short pieces on a few categories within the book that I'll show you in a moment. And then she incorporates a batch of citations from the primary sources. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get into that in a second. So here she is. She's a progressive educator. She's progressive in the sense that we're talking about the mid to late 19th century in France, and part of a system of colleges which were offering higher education opportunities to women that previously weren't able to have them. This was happening as a trend across Europe at the time. In many other European countries, men were taking the teaching roles. In France, they mandated that women would be assigned these roles. She was one of the educators concerned, and she ended up becoming one of the directors of the college at which she was teaching. And she had these novel teaching methods. So she would take the students on walks through the park and think about the world at large in relation to the philosophy that they were learning. She would invite them to dinner, and they would talk about philosophical concepts over their meals. And at the end of their course, when they graduated, she would offer them all a book, and it's one of the books, not unlike the one that I've got up the back that we're talking about today, where she would go through a moral structure for a particular thinker. And so she wrote books like this on Socrates, on Aristotle, on Plutarch, on Cicero, and on the Stoics. So she's novel in that during this period, there aren't that many people encouraging the study of Stoicism, but she is one of them. And she's doing it because she's motivated to live virtuously and to study theories which impel us to live virtuously. She's also interested in the connectedness of all people. And again, as I discussed this morning, the Stoics are interested in the system of our interconnectedness. She compared Stoicism and Christianity. And we're aware possibly that when we refer to God in Stoicism, it's not the same kind of God that many modern religions will talk about. But nevertheless, God permeates the term God, and Zeus and other like vernacular permeates the ancient Stoic texts. So it's somewhat of an unavoidable aspect of the philosophy. And there has been a recent push, I would say, to cull ancient Stoicism of its theologically oriented discourse. And I want to involve you in this as well. So I'm wondering, in your Stoic practice in 2024, in an increasingly secularized environment, how do you feel about the aspect of the ancient Stoic text, which is so God is so central, and mentions of God are so central, mentions of the divine are so central? Do you think about it when you're practicing your Stoicism? No?
Well, if you don't mind, I was meant to ask this question a while ago because you mentioned a few times throughout the day about Stoic and non-Stoic and cult. And I need some clarification if you can help me there. Before we move into the topic of God, is because my understanding is what Stoicism is a philosophy, a school of thought. And so when you subscribe to that school of thought, it means you share the beliefs and values. And so it's much like if you say you're Catholic, you believe in the Catholic values. It doesn't necessarily mean that you were saying that you are the role model in the Catholic beliefs, for example. So I always thought that calling oneself as a Stoic, meaning that you say that you subscribe to that school of thought. So that you either believe in temperance or you say like, oh, life's too short, just go and have fun. So you either that or you're not, right? So then I always thought that saying that, I'm a Stoic mean that, yes, I believe in the Stoic values. I believe in that school of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so and not so much like, hey, I have mastered all the Stoic virtues. I've never thought of it that case. So I found that a few speakers have been very humble in calling themselves Stoic, which confused me a bit because then I'm not sure whether they fully subscribe to the values of Stoic, school of thoughts, or whether they're saying that they are not yet mastering the Stoic virtues. But yes, so just if you could then clarify that would be great. And there might not be one right answer. And on the topic of God, I think, we humans are very good at trying to come up with ways to explain things. And so 2000 years ago, there was not a lot of explanations for why things happen that way. And obviously we have way advanced now in explaining things. So there used to be belief that God made the thunders and all that, but then we know why thunder happened. So I guess in the modern context, it's probably less relevant to use sort of an unknown or powerful explanation for why things happen the way they are.
Right.
So that's just my idea.
Okay, a quick answer to the first question. I would say I can only answer it from my perspective. And I don't know what the definition of a cult is, but perhaps you would have to subscribe wholly to every position within the cult to be a cult member, possibly. With Stoicism and with philosophies, I'm not entirely sure you need to subscribe to every single parameter of the philosophy in order to consider yourself an advocate of the philosophy. That could be up to interpretation. I would say I'm not necessarily someone who is a Stoic, but there are a number of Stoic positions with which I'm in agreement. Regarding God, for me, God is a synonym for substance, for the world, etc. And so I have no problem with keeping the word God in the philosophy as long as it's discussed in that way. But I do see there are people who are encouraging rewriting of the text where we strip it of its divine vernacular. I can see someone shaking their head over here.
I agree.
Yeah.
I always think that God, nature, whatever you want to call it, and I always think what I read Stoicism. What would have happened if Constantine would have taken on Stoicism instead of Christianity? How the world would have been.
Yeah.
And I'm always thinking of that. I think Christianity has a lot of Stoicism, or a lot from Stoicism, but no, we have to leave the divine or whatever you want to call it, Zeus, in the text.
Yeah.
Thanks. So that's a great question because it's central to adopting Stoicism in the 21st century and beyond. And I don't think you should kind of strip out, the religious ideas and early Stoicism. That's just crap. But to talk about Stoicism in the 21st century, you have to say, well, what's our understanding of things as Buddhists now, especially since most people are non-theistic in their approach to Stoicism. I think you really have to try and work through the implications of taking out theism and replacing it with perhaps physics and evolution and various other explanations that we have for the world that we live in. Because I think one of the things about the world, which is a little bit about the world of Stoics I lived in back in it didn't change, it sort of went in circles, the sun rose and set, civilizations rose and fall, the land went through the seasons. It didn't have the view of the world we have now, where the whole universe is getting some sort of weird destruction in 50 billion years. And evolution has changed the shape of creatures on the earth. So they lived in a quite different world, it's quite different implications for how they view nature and our place in nature.
Yeah.
So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done to bring Stoicism into the 21st century. And simply striving at references to God doesn't help at all.
No,
You better to leave it there.
no, I mean, the physics is already so integral to the philosophy.
Yeah.
In a way, the physics already is the God, right? So we can replace the term God with a term from physics if we like. I'm not entirely sure that benefits as well.
This question is right up my alley. So coming from a more Christian worldview and then assessing Stoicism, there's obviously a lot of overlap, and both of them were kind of coming to, a lot of the writers were, around the same time. But we can now, as you said, like we're looking back and do we have a revisionist version of Stoicism? I know in Christianity, there's a lot of Christian groups that try to do that and impose their morality or their different ideas on the historical things that happened, and that is unwise, because then we don't learn from history, we change it to how it adapts to us. I think one of the things that I've seen, and this goes back to the thing that we were talking about earlier, the kind of new wave of people interested in Stoicism from its practicality and its utility, and that's the reason they're jumping onto it. And then they might get deeper into, okay, well, where did these ideas actually come from? And I think a lot of people are too quick to hold on to their beliefs about metaphysics or about God in general, however you want to define it, and get rid of it without realizing that those are some of the most fundamental building blocks to even coming to the idea that virtues are something that we ought to pursue. There's so many, even in that sentence, there's so many words so packed with importance and value there, that if you get rid of the idea of God that Stoicism is built on, and many other philosophies and religions, it's a tower that it's like a, what's that game where you pull all the blocks out and then suddenly it falls because the underpinnings are not there. So I think even, yes, you can replace things like God creating something with evolution, but there's other more fundamental principles and transcendental categories that have to be affirmed in a Stoic worldview that are still unjustified in some way. Or there's some axioms that we just say, logic exists or morality exists, and there is a uniformity to nature and it has to be this way, that we're then building the rest of the worldview on. So once you get rid of God or a reason for those to exist, it kind of all tumbles down. So I'm not saying that there's a correct or incorrect view, but we do need to think more about, if we are going to reject something, we ought to have something much more stable to replace it with.
Right. I think maybe Roger down the front and then.
You didn't want to hold the whole thing in this question, did you?
But I invited this.
Okay, so the first thing I'd say is you've been very familiar with Montaigne, who's basically perceived as both a Stoic and a Pyrrhonian skeptic, right? So he took a position, but didn't entirely, well, he was skeptical of his own position. So the first thing I'd say is that's a good place to be, because you never know what you'll learn later, right? You should always be open to changing your mind. And it's one of the beauties about reading Montaigne. Will, you pointed out, it's important to have a humility on this. You might be wrong, but on this, it's interesting. To change it is very dangerous because you might be wrong, and it's really as simple as that. And we never know, if you're tempted to change one piece, you could change another. You could change. Where does it stop? In a world where you might be wrong. So whether God's important for your understanding of Stoicism, it doesn't matter. I think Will, it was you that pointed out it, be it atoms or providence.
Yeah,
Marx said it didn't really matter. He said he would still land on the same ethical outcome.
Yeah.
At least in that part of the
Yeah.
text.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous to change it. I think Montaigne would be suspicious anyway, because you might be wrong.
yeah, it's like, once you do start changing these terms, then the translation becomes different. Even working with a text from this era, she is working with a differently worded text to what we read in a translation from the late 20th century typically. So, yes,
So,
Okay. I might have to do it's gonna be a race as it is. Okay, so one of the main arguments from the book is that for the Stoics, we are fraternal and social creatures. Now, the last time I was in this room, I remembered it as being smaller, and which is why I thought it would be okay to put this up. Is it for the people in the back? Is that okay? Okay, this is like a terrible teaching method to put a slide of text on a PowerPoint, but I continue to do it. So yes, this is taken from one of the first pages of the book, and she is making the claim that according to the Stoics, we are born essentially to live in societies. You'll see that there's this reference to the great body, so this singular social body of which each human is a member. There's a very practical element to this definition of the social side, where we provide each other with mutual support. And she invokes Seneca's ideas on this. Seneca says, where does our safety come from? But this reciprocity of services. So, as the argument develops regarding the Stoic idea of the fraternal nature of the human, she then involves the theme of kinship from Marcus Aurelius in particular. And I think this is quite an important passage from Marcus Aurelius, where he talks about a holy kinship that unites each human with each other, essentially. One of the potentially more abstract features of this citation is this notion of same intelligence, in which we participate. What does that mean that we participate in intelligence? Because typically we think we have intelligence. As individuals, we have different varieties, possibly different quantifiably different quantifiable amounts of intelligence. But do we participate in something rather than possessing something that is called intelligence? The reason that both Favre and Marcus Aurelius will call our relationship with intelligence to be a participation is because of this idea of the universal intelligence, rationality, the universal rationality of which we are an expression. Remember this morning I was talking about our mind being a fragment of the world itself. We derive our mind, our body, everything about us from a world that precedes us. And so therefore the mind that we adopt, inherit, which is a fragment of a greater body, is possessed, but with an intelligence that participates in a universal intelligence. So that is why Marcus Aurelius is using this term, participate in intelligence. And it's a characterization that Julie Favre endorses. Another aspect of the fraternal side of the human for the Stoics is that we accept our common fate. Not how we're all going to die similarly, but although we are all going to die, but rather just that we have this common fate, and that common fate is our common state, essentially. And our common state is that we are all of this one singular body, the great social body that is referenced there. So that is the argument around the fraternity of the human. The next theme is justice. And Favre presents quite an astute account, I believe, of the nature of justice for the Stoics. And it's more than just treating others fairly, and it's more than just obeying the laws of our contingent social environments, wherever they're placed geographically. Rather, justice means being rational. So if it means being rational, then for the Stoics, firstly, we have to look at the internal nature of justice rather than the external nature of justice. So this is taken from later in the text, and the Stoics are absolutists, so you're either just or you're not just. That's fairly straightforward. And you're also just not simply because you are, again, adhering to whatever the local laws and customs are where you live, but rather because you make your internality justice. And how do you do that? You live rationally. I don't need to go on about that after what we talked about earlier today, but justice is an internal function in this regard. Nevertheless, Seneca reminds us that the just person satisfies the justness that is within them and which is infinite. So again, this is what I mentioned earlier this morning about what I love about the Stoics, this ambiguity of the internal and the external. The thing which is internal to you, your rationality, is a trace of something beyond you. It's a trace of a universal rationality in which all your fellow humans share. This is why it's described as infinite. It's not exclusive to you. It's something in which you are participating, as Marcus Aurelius said on the last slide regarding intelligence. So because justice has a seat in your internality, your mind, it means that you can be unjust, not simply in terms of how you behave to other people, or in generally, but also in thought. This might be common sense for us, but it's worth saying that you can be unjust even by thinking in irrational ways, let's say. I think we might skip the question. Okay, so the final part of the book, is concerns two types of charity. Remember, this is a book about our duties to each other. The first element of charity for the Stoics, according to Julie Favre, is of leniency. But she said leniency isn't just about charity. Being lenient is also about justice. So, taken from the text, Favre describes how the Stoics practice leniency through justice as much as they do through charity. And I kind of hinted at this in the panel discussion. It refers to the fact that when we are condemning others for things that they do, we'd better be very careful, because inevitably the things about which we're condemning them relate equally to ourselves. So to avoid this, in order to be just, and therefore to act charitably, the Stoics urge us to instruct those who we see as being mistaken with gentleness and kindness. And I think a couple of the members of the panel raised this in the last session. Marcus Aurelius steps in at this point, and Favre notes that he reminds us that Zeus has tolerated and cared for people who are unjust, who are wicked, who are off the path for centuries. We come along and we're here for fewer than 100 years, and we can't tolerate it. We're so sensitive. He says when we do this, we become the same as the people that we are condemning for being irrational. So you see why I might describe Stoicism as a philosophy of humility. I would like to ask this question, because I think this is counterintuitive in terms of how some people appraise the philosophy. Do you consider Stoicism to be a philosophy of leniency?
This is where role ethics comes in. If I'm a policeman or a judge, it's my role to determine whether somebody is worthy of punishment or not. But for the rest of us, maybe we can suspend judgment. Maybe we've got the luxury to be able to do that.
I would think that Stoicism is more of a philosophy of self-accountability rather than leniency. So,
I would say yes, very much so, but maybe not in the most obvious interpretation. I think by being fact-based, by telling us to focus on the thing that has actually happened and not the story we tell ourselves about that thing, that is inherently lenient, because it is when we go from an observed fact to some explanation of why somebody did something, that's when we're not lenient. That's when we ascribe to others a maliciousness that may not exist. So I think absolutely by its nature it's lenient.
Yeah, particularly for realists, I think Stoic view is that people who, commit offences, let's say, to which things we find offensive, are in some way mistaken. He's quite emphatic about this in a number of ways, and that our job is to somehow try and help them to get to a more correct position.
Yeah.
So he is very much like that. I think that, that's sort of where it comes from. I think the current justice system is quite arguable. But I think I suspect it's not such a problem of convicting people on offences. It's what you do after you convicted them. That's the problem. If someone does something which is painful or offensive, someone else like that, and crash it, still should do something. It's just that what we tend to do tends to make things worse.
Right.
But better, that's a problem.
I think,
I think leniency, it's a matter of degrees. At some point, will not tend to injustice if you're too lenient. There must be, I guess the wisdom is finding that balance important.
yeah. And I think that's how most systems work in terms of correcting what might coldly be described as errors. It's that finding that line. Okay, I've got a couple of minutes to go through the final, sorry, Lynn, did you want final part. So then we move on to what Favre calls active charity. And this distinguishes our relationship with the rest of the world and with each other from being described as parts, which the Stoics will call too abstract, to being limbs. And the reason that the word limb is used is because it infers that there is a mutual benefit to be gained between limbs, a relationship of mutual benefit that cannot be attributed to parts, which can be abstracted from each other. So I'll show you what I mean. So Marcus Aurelius is one of the advocates of this again. And he says we're all made to cooperate together. If you say that you're only a part, then it's as though in his mind you're only doing what you're doing for decorum, as he puts it. So what Favre is getting at here is the notion, and indeed there's a section in the book, I believe, called "To give is to receive." When we're the limbs of one singular body, then what we're giving to when we give to an individual is not restricted to just giving to the individual. We're giving to the body itself. So the comparison here with the body is that if one limb gives to another part of the body, all parts of the body, I'm using the incorrect terminologies there, so ingrained. All limbs of the body will benefit from being connected to the body itself. And that's the way that she and Marcus Aurelius see our relationship with each other. It's not that we're simply helping each other, we're helping something combined from which we derive benefit as well. Hence, to give as a limb to the body is to receive from the body. Sometimes we might give and receive to and from that body through individual interaction. But we're all limbs of a singular body, a common body, and therefore that is the cooperation to which Marcus Aurelius refers. So then, how to give? There are a few parameters here that Favre goes through that define the nature of rational giving. Essentially, it comes down to don't pursue the fruit of the deed, just pursue the deed itself. Just do something good. Don't have anticipation of what doing good will bring back to you. Because by default, doing good, i.e. giving, will be received. You don't have to worry about it. Problems occur, according to the Stoics, Favre tells us, when we give in anticipation of the receiving. If we're focusing just on the act of giving, the act of doing good, if we're just focused on what we share in common, this being part of this community, and by community, that great social body, then we'll receive through the giving. The other aspect is to ignore, or not to, or ignoring gratitude is probably the fair way to describe it. If you give, and the person to whom you give is ungrateful, don't be perturbed by that. A main reason for that is if you give, and the person that receives is ungrateful, then and you become irritated, then you are also ungrateful that you've been given the opportunity to give in the first place. So you're no longer giving or receiving, and you become one of what Marcus Aurelius might describe as the abscess. You become detached from the rational order. Finally, how to receive. Remember that you received. Be grateful. Remember your participation in this collective thing, this blob of which you are a limb. And that's where you can find the book. Thank you very much. Or you can get from me to that.
Wow, that was wonderful as always. So yes, copies are available of